Hello, class. We're going to continue our study of evolution by looking at how the theory of evolution came to be. In other words, the evolution of the theory of evolution. And we have a cast of characters here. So this is Lamarck, Weismann, and this is Charles Darwin. Darwin is probably the one that you know the most about, which makes sense because he is the one who gets most of the credit. Down here we have some pictures of some people that you should recognize: Watson, Crick, and Rosalind Franklin. You don't have to know about this guy. We'll talk about how they fit into this story a little later. So today we're going to start with Lamarck. So Lamarck believed that if you use certain parts of your body more, the stronger it would get. So example one here is if you work out and you build large muscles, you'll get jacked like Mr. McNally, and you'll have this like amazing physique. And according to Lamarck, those types of traits that you develop will be passed down to your offspring or your children. Another example is a giraffe needs to reach high branches to get more food, and it stretches its neck to do that. And he believed that since the parent stretched its neck and made it longer, that these acquired traits are going to be inherited by the baby giraffes. I think most of you see a flaw in the theory. Would me do I pass on my stronger muscles to my offspring because I worked out and spent a lot of time in the gym? Does a giraffe pass on its longer neck to its offspring because it stretched its neck during its life? I would imagine most of you would disagree with this. How many of you probably wear braces or wore braces? Does that mean your children are going to be born with straight teeth? The answer to that, as you know, is no, because your genetics, your genes, the DNA inside of your cells really determines what your children inherit. But you have to remember, even though Lamarck's theory, I call him loser Lamarck, even though he's a loser in scientific theory, he didn't know because they hadn't discovered DNA yet. They haven't discovered the laws of heredity. So they were kind of taking guesses and making theories based upon much less knowledge than you have. So I guess this is a picture of Lamarck, the acquired traits. First, it was like a little, this is Giraffus anellous. It was a very short giraffe and couldn't reach too many high branches, so it stretched its neck and its offspring grew taller than it did in its lifetime. And by the time you get to the fourth generation, it evolved into Giraffus McNallius, a much taller, much better looking giraffe than the original. But as we know, that doesn't really happen. A giraffe with short genes would probably wind up giving its offspring short genes. So something else was going on. Weismann is a scientist that decided to come up with experiments to prove Lamarck was wrong, to prove that Lamarck was a loser. Weismann looks a lot like I do today, actually, now that I'm in quarantine. But Weismann said that you don't pass on the traits that you acquire. Acquired traits do not get inherited. He's said, it's not like you use muscles and you don't use muscles and that what gets passed on. So he decided to prove this with mice because mice are much easier to use. They are very plentiful, they reproduce frequently, they have a very short life and reproductive span. So he decided to cut some tails off of some mice. And then he decided to mate the mice with no tails to other mice with cut off tails. And he found, as you would expect, that all of the offspring, the baby mice, all had tails. So changing the physical appearance to the life of a adult does not affect the offspring. So therefore, organisms do not inherit the acquired characteristics of no tails or anything that happens to you in life. If you break a leg or if you have a part of your body amputated, that does not change the DNA that will make your future children. Of course, they didn't know about DNA. They just knew that what Lamarck was saying is wrong. So after thousands of experiments, I guess we could finally say that his results were valid. Now, what is causing species to evolve? That's when we bring in Charles Darwin. So Darwin visited the islands, I don't know what just happened. Darwin visited the islands of the Galapagos. And the Galapagos are off the coast of Ecuador, out in South America, and there are lots of different islands that had lots of different microenvironments. Some were drier, some were wetter, some were surrounded by rough seas, and some were surrounded by calm oceans. Some got water that came up from the South Pole and was cooler. Others got more equatorial or equator type water. So the climates and the conditions on each island were a little bit different from the other islands. And because of that, lots of different animals that looked similar but were very different in certain ways were being found on different islands. So Darwin thought something was going on that was causing these changes or this evolution. He came up with his theory, which is called natural selection. So whenever you hear the words natural selection, you should think of Darwin and evolution. So on the Galapagos Island, he noticed that there were lots of different finches. Each island had its own type of bird. The finches, he discovered, all ate different foods. He followed them around and watched how they lived. And because they were eating different foods, we say they were in different niches. You should remember that word from when we learned about ecology. So each bird was filling a different role in a different type of environment on each island. And what he noticed made each bird more different was the beaks. All of their beaks were adapted for the different types of food that was being eaten. So you might find on this island here, the finches had large beaks and they were eating big seeds, whereas on this island over here, where the climate there wasn't as much rain, maybe the seeds were very small and the birds wound up with smaller beaks. So here's a picture of some of the finches that he discovered. So if you look at beaks 1, 2, 3, and 4, you could answer these questions. Which finch probably eats the large seeds? Well, you'd probably think 1, maybe 2 would eat large seeds because they have beaks that are adapted or built for eating bigger food. Which ones would eat small seeds? Well, you'd probably look down here at number 3 and 4 and realize that smaller beaks could probably handle smaller food better. And then which of the birds could have poked into plants to find bugs? So one of these beaks is more of a probing beak, and that would be number 4. It's more sharp and pointed, so it could probably poke into areas a little bit better than the ones with the thicker or wider beaks. Yet they're all finches, and they're all very similar in other ways. The beaks are very different. This is some actual pictures of some of the beaks of some of the finches that Darwin discovered when he was doing his exploration. And Darwin breaks his theory up into certain components. And basically what Darwin is saying is that all organisms that reproduce, and especially those that reproduce sexually, we should think of, I think it'll help, produce more offspring than can survive. They produce way more rabbits or way more birds than the environment will allow to live. So if you go out into nature, you'll find that even though a rabbit might give birth to like 7 rabbits, probably only 2, maybe 1 or 2 of those would survive to adulthood to reproduce on its own. So most of those babies don't survive to create another generation of rabbits. And that's because they're all different. So the other thing that Darwin was saying, and this is where I mean with sexual reproduction, variation is very, very common in sexual reproduction, less so in asexual. But even in asexual reproduction, there are sometimes differences due to, we know now mutations and things like that. But each offspring will have some different traits. So those baby rabbits, one might have longer ears, one might have stronger leg muscles, one might be a lighter color, so one might have better eyesight. So they're all going to have different variations that are going to allow them, or some of them, to survive better in the environment that they're living in. So you've got too many baby rabbits, and they're all a little different. Well, Darwin would say the next element would be competition. Because there's too many of them, and they're all living in the same environment, even though they're brothers and sisters and they're all rabbits, they're going to have to compete for the limited amount of food. That doesn't mean they're going to fight each other, but they are going to also be kind of struggling over the amount of food that's available and the amount of shelter that's available and the number of predators that they have to escape. So some of them will have better variations, maybe better eyesight, maybe stronger legs, that were going to let them survive better in this environment than others. And the ones without good adaptations, the ones that don't have the good traits, will probably get killed or starve or be driven out because they can't survive in that area. So that's what Darwin would call the survival of the fittest. It's not always the strongest. Sometimes it's the smartest. Sometimes it's the one with the best eyesight. Sometimes it's the one that can find food a little bit easier than the others. So Darwin would say that as the population of rabbits gets picked off by predators, sorry about that, as the population of rabbits gets picked off by predators or starves or gets driven out of the territory, only the fittest will be there at the end. And they're the ones, the survivors, that will create the next generation of rabbits. They'll pass on their genes, which will be their traits. So the rabbits, or it could be giraffes, it could be those finches, whichever ones are the most suited for that environment, that have the best physical traits that will let them survive, will create the new generation. And therefore, Darwin says that over many generations, you'll wind up with a species that's different from the original, because they will have increased in number of good traits, and a lot of those bad traits, the ones that weren't helpful, will die out, which will over time change the entire look of the species. So maybe it was the color of the rabbit was better suited to a cold environment. So maybe the lighter colored rabbits were surviving better because they were avoiding predators. So when competition and survival of the fittest happened, more and more light colored rabbits were born until eventually all the dark ones are gone. Maybe it takes hundreds or thousands of years, and the whole population is now white colored or light colored. That would be an evolution of a new species of rabbit after many generations. So we'll go back into this again. We're going to look at a video, and then we're going to also do some questions, and we'll talk more about DNA and how that has influenced our theory of evolution in modern times. But I just want to make sure you guys all got the introduction to where we got to Darwin's theory. And just so you know, he wasn't the first person to come up with the idea of how different species came to be, but he is the one whose idea proved to be the correct idea that we still believe and follow in science today. All right, guys, have a great day, and we'll check in again in a couple of days.